The baton sliced through the heavy, velvet air of the Musikverein, drawing a triumphant, deafening chord from the orchestra. From the maestro's podium, Blaise looked like a god commanding a storm, his tuxedo pristine, his posture flawless. In the VIP box, his beautiful wife, Celestine, smiled with a psychologist's practiced elegance, the picture of devotion. But hidden beneath the sheet music on Blaise's stand wasn't just the final movement of Mahler's Symphony No. 5. It was a glossy photograph of Celestine, tangled in the sheets of a cheap hotel room with his lead cellist. Tonight, the music wasn't a performance. It was a countdown to their mutual destruction. If stories of dark secrets, shattered trust, and calculated revenge behind the velvet curtains of high society speak to you, stay with me. The air in the Musikverein was thick, saturated with the scent of expensive perfumes, aged wood, and the electric anticipation of 2,000 elites waiting for a masterpiece. Blaise stood in the wings, the heavy velvet curtain brushing his shoulder. Out there, the orchestra was tuning, a chaotic, discordant hum that perfectly mirrored the violent noise inside his own head. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, not with stage fright. He had conquered that a decade ago, but with a toxic, corrosive rage that had been eating him alive for exactly 72 hours. 72 hours since the notification. 72 hours since his wife's iPad, synced carelessly to their home network, had downloaded a hidden album straight into his line of sight. Maestro, Blaise blinked, his dark eyes snapping to the stage manager, a young man who looked appropriately terrified of the famous conductor's intense silence. 2 minutes, the manager whispered, bowing his head slightly. Thank you, Thomas, Blaise replied, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that betrayed absolutely nothing. It was the voice of a man in control, the voice of a genius, the voice of a fool who hadn't realized his entire life was a carefully constructed lie. He adjusted his white bow tie, his reflection in the backstage mirror staring back at him. He looked distinguished, untouchable. No one looking at him could guess that burned into his retinas was the image of his wife, Celestine, the brilliant, poised psychologist who commanded thousands an hour to fix other people's marriages. Arched over the hotel room desk, her skin flushed, her hands tangled in the hair of his first cellist. Julian. Just thinking the name made Blaise's grip on his baton tighten until his knuckles turned bone white. He could hear Julian out there right now, drawing his bow across the A string, finding his pitch. How many times had Blaise praised the man's vibrato? How many times had they drank scotch in the study, while Celestine sat on the sofa, her legs elegantly crossed, smiling at her husband's protege? A soft rustle of silk broke his dark reverie. Darling. Blaise didn't need to turn to know it was her. The scent of Tom Ford's black orchid preceded her, a scent that used to mean home, but now just smelled like the sheets of the Hotel Sacre. Celestine stepped into the dim light of the wings. She was breathtaking in an emerald green evening gown, her blonde hair swept up in a flawless chignon. She reached out, her cool, manicured fingers resting gently on his tuxedo lapel. You look tense, she murmured, her blue eyes filled with a manufactured concern that made Blaise physically sick. Remember your breathing. The Mahler is in your blood, Blaise. You're going to be brilliant. He forced his facial muscles to soften, forced the corners of his mouth to turn upward into a loving smile. It was the hardest performance he had ever given, far more demanding than the symphony he was about to conduct. I always am, when you're watching, he said softly. Celestine leaned in and pressed her lips to his cheek. I'll be in the VIP box, playing every note with you. I bet you will, he thought, watching her walk away, her hips swaying with practiced grace. As she disappeared into the corridor leading to the audience boxes, Blaise reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. His fingers brushed against a thick, folded envelope. He didn't pull it out. He just needed to know it was there. Inside was the insurance policy, the match that would burn this opulent world to the ground. He knew Sybil, the venomous arts reporter for Der Standard, was sitting in row F. He had ensured she got the premium ticket. She had walked into the kitchen wearing a white silk robe, her skin flushed from the shower, smelling of expensive vanilla and lavender. She looked like an angel descending into domestic tranquility. "You're up early, my love," she had murmured, pressing a kiss to the crown of his head. Her lips had felt like a branding iron against his scalp. Blaze had kept his eyes locked on the black screen, just thinking about the mauler. The pacing in the third movement still feels unresolved. "You demand perfection, Blaze. That's why you are who you are," she had replied, turning her back to him to operate the espresso machine. The hiss of the steam had masked the sharp, ragged intake of his breath. She poured 2 cups, setting one gently in front of him before taking the seat opposite. For the next 20 minutes, Blaze had endured a masterclass in psychological deception. "I have a difficult session today," Celestine had sighed, elegantly wrapping her manicured hands around her porcelain cup. "The Fisher couple." He finally admitted to the affair, but he's employing textbook Darvo tactics. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It is fascinating how predictably the human mind scrambles to preserve its own perceived innocence. Blaze had slowly lifted his gaze to meet hers. Her blue eyes were clear, bright, and filled with a clinical empathy that she sold for €800 an hour. She was sitting there, a renowned expert on marital fidelity, dissecting another man's betrayal while the scent of Julian's cologne probably still lingered in her pores from the afternoon before. "Is that so?" Blaze had managed to say, his voice perfectly modulated, a low, resonant hum. "And how do you treat a man who lies so flawlessly to the person he claims to love?" Celestine had smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips that conveyed profound professional wisdom. "You have to dismantle their illusion of control. People who betray their partners often suffer from a narcissistic detachment. They don't see the spouse as a person anymore, but as a fixture in their life. You have to force them to look at the wreckage they've caused." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her words had nearly broken his restraint. A violent tremor had traveled up his arm, forcing him to grip the edge of the marble island to keep his hands from shaking. He had realized, in that freezing moment, that she was not just a cheat. She was an apex predator of human emotion. She didn't just lie, she wore her lies like haute couture. Speaking of the orchestra, Celestine had continued smoothly, taking a delicate sip of her espresso. "How is Julian handling the solo? He seemed a bit overwhelmed at dinner last month. He looks up to you so much, Blaze. He views you as a father figure, you know." A father figure. The words were a serrated blade twisting in his gut. He remembered a specific photo, time-stamped just last week, of Julian's hands bruised with passion, gripping Celestine's waist. "Julian," Blaze had said, testing the name on his tongue like a poisonous berry. "Julian is performing exactly as I expect him to. He will hit every note he is meant to hit." "You're a wonderful mentor to him," she had whispered, reaching across the island to stroke the back of his hand. Blaze had not pulled away. He had sat there, letting the monster in his kitchen touch him, realizing that simply handing her divorce papers would be an insult to the agony she had unknowingly inflicted. She wanted to talk about dismantling illusions of control. She wanted to talk about wreckage. Looking into his wife's beautiful, lying eyes, Blaze had finally decided what he was going to do. The rehearsal room in the subterranean levels of the State Opera House smelled intensely of crushed rosin, brass polish, and the nervous sweat of 60 elite musicians. It was exactly 48 hours before the gala. Blaze stood elevated on the conductor's podium, his spine perfectly rigid, wrapped in a dark cashmere turtleneck that made him look like a shadow cast against the acoustic panels. Directly in front of him, occupying the prestigious first chair, sat Julian. The physical posture required to play the cello, the wide, open stance, the intense, almost protective embrace of the wooden instrument, suddenly made Blaze nauseous. Every time Julian leaned into a downward bow stroke, Blaze's mind flashed with violent clarity to the digital photographs. He saw Julian's broad shoulders moving. He saw those highly insured, dexterous fingers, so precise on the ebony fingerboard, tangled instead in Celestine's blonde hair. From measure 42, Blaze commanded, his voice a flat, deadened instrument. The second movement. He raised his baton. They were playing Mahler's Stürmisch bewegt, MIT Grosser vehemence. Stormy, with the greatest vehemence. It was a bitterly appropriate soundtrack to the poison pumping through Blaze's veins. The music crashed through the room like a physical wave. Blaze guided them with sharp, economic gestures, his exterior a mask of supreme professional focus. But inside the cage of his ribs, his heart was a frantic, bruised thing. He watched Julian look up from the sheet music, seeking the maestro's approval. The younger man possessed a subtle, arrogant smirk, the effortless confidence of a prodigy who believed he had conquered the world. Julian thought he was untouchable. He thought he possessed the great conductor's wife, a secret trophy kept in expensive hotel rooms. Blaze let the heavy brass section swell, feeling the aggressive vibration through the leather soles of his shoes. The dilemma clawed fiercely at his throat, a physical constriction. He could step down from this podium right now. He could grab the heavy iron base of his music stand and bring it crashing down on Julian's hands, shattering the bones that had ruined his life. It would be so remarkably easy. One brief, blinding explosion of violence to silence the screaming in his head. But what would that achieve? Assault charges, disgrace, the destruction of his own legacy. He would be painted as the crazed, jealous older husband, and Celestine, with her brilliant psychological manipulation, would spin it to the press as a tragic narrative of a deteriorating man. No, the stakes were far too high to settle for cheap violence. His revenge required absolute patience. It required a stage larger than a basement rehearsal room. Suddenly, Blaze snapped his wrist, slamming the tip of his baton violently against his music stand. Crack! The orchestra ground to a chaotic, squeaking halt. Silence plunged into the room, heavy, suffocating, and absolute. 60 musicians held their breath, their eyes darting nervously to the maestro. Blaze did not look at the violins. He did not acknowledge the French horns. His dark, hollow gaze bypassed them all and locked directly onto Julian. The phrasing is entirely too indulgent, Julian, Blaze said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register that somehow echoed louder than a shout. Julian blinked, sitting up straighter, the arrogant smirk instantly faltering. A flush of pink crept up his neck. Maestro, I thought the heavy vibrato added the necessary warmth to the transition. This movement is not about warmth, Blaze replied. He stepped down from the podium and walked slowly toward the cello section. The musicians subtly leaned away, yielding to the cold fury radiating from him. It is about grief. It is about the violent realization that everything you thought was beautiful is actually rotting from the inside out. Blaze stopped a mere 2 feet from Julian. He stared down at the young man, his eyes entirely dead, transmitting a silent, lethal promise that Julian could feel but not comprehend. Your playing is arrogant, Blaze whispered. The words meant only for the cellist. It is the playing of a boy who takes things that do not belong to him, believing there are no consequences in the dark. Strip the ego from the notes, Julian. Play it as if your life depends on it. Because in this hall, it does. A flicker of genuine dread crossed Julian's features. He swallowed hard, nodding quickly, his knuckles white around his bow. Blaze turned his back, returning to the podium with measured, deliberate steps. He raised his baton once more. He had tasted the control, and it fortified his resolve. The countdown to their mutual destruction continued. The penthouse was eerily silent, bathed in the cool, gray light of a Thursday afternoon. Celestine was at her clinic in the city center, supposedly counseling the wealthy and neurotic, while Blaze was supposed to be at the opera house going over the final lighting cues for the gala. Instead, he stood in the doorway of her private study, a room he rarely entered. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, masking the stench of deceit that now clung to every surface in his mind. He had spent the last 2 hours methodically tearing through her life, searching for the missing pieces of the puzzle. The hidden cloud folder had been the smoking gun, but Blaze needed the bullet. He needed the why. He moved past the rows of psychological journals and leather-bound first editions, his fingers trailing over the polished mahogany desk. His eyes landed on a small, locked drawer on the left side. It was a detail he had never questioned in 10 years of marriage, dismissing it as a place for confidential patient notes. But now, the lock gleamed like a taunt. He didn't bother looking for the key. He walked to the kitchen, retrieved a heavy metal letter opener from the mail console, and returned to the study. With a cold, terrifying calm, he wedged the blade into the gap above the drawer and applied brute force. The wood splintered with a sharp crack, the lock giving way with a metallic snap. Blaze pulled the drawer open. Inside lay a chaotic jumble of items that made no sense at first glance. A burner phone, several prepaid debit cards, and a thick stack of printed emails. But it was a plain white envelope, buried beneath the plastic cards, that caught his eye. He pulled it out, his pulse hammering a steady, rhythmic beat against his ribs. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant, sweeping, and undeniably Julian's. It was the same handwriting that meticulously marked tempo changes on the first chair's sheet music. Blaze unfolded the single sheet of heavy linen paper inside. The date was from 3 weeks ago. "My brilliant Celestine," the letter began. The endearment made Blaze's stomach clench violently, a physical reflex to the poison. But he forced his eyes down the page, devouring the cursive script. "I deposited the latest installment from the Fisher account yesterday. 500,000 euros. They paid so quickly, it's almost insulting how easy you make this. Your psychological profiles are terrifyingly accurate. They genuinely believe I'll release the recordings to the press if they don't comply." Blaze stopped reading. The air in the room seemed to evaporate, leaving him struggling for breath. The Fisher account. The very couple Celestine had been discussing over espresso just days ago, dissecting the husband's infidelity with clinical detachment. He read on, his eyes flying across the page, his mind desperately trying to process the magnitude of the horror. "The money is safely secured offshore, just as we planned. Another year of this, my love, and we won't need Vienna anymore. We won't need the orchestra, or the clinic, or him. We can finally disappear. I love you, Julian." The letter slipped from Blaze's fingers, drifting slowly to the Persian rug below. He staggered back, hitting the edge of a bookshelf, his chest heaving. The sheer, monstrous scale of his wife's betrayal hit him like a physical blow. This was not a simple, sordid affair. This was not a midlife crisis or a lapse in judgment born of neglect. This was a calculated, predatory enterprise. Celestine was using her position as a marital therapist to identify the vulnerabilities and infidelities of the city's elite. She was feeding that information to Julian, who then seduced or blackmailed them, extorting millions to fund their escape. And Blaze, the oblivious, devoted husband, was nothing more than the perfect, respectable cover story. He looked down at the letter on the floor. It was a death sentence, not just for their marriage, but for their entire lives. If this letter saw the light of day, Celestine and Julian wouldn't just be disgraced, they would be imprisoned. A dark, terrifying laugh bubbled up in Blaze's throat, echoing in the quiet study. It was a sound devoid of any joy, a sound that belonged to a man who had completely shattered and was now rebuilding himself from the razor-sharp fragments. The dilemma was gone. The hesitation was eradicated. There would be no private confrontation, no desperate demands for explanation. The stakes had transcended a broken heart. They were now about absolute annihilation. He knelt, picking up the letter with shaking, deliberate hands. He didn't just have the bullet anymore. He had the bomb, and he knew exactly where to detonate it. Café Spurl, with its velvet upholstery and haze of expensive cigar smoke, had long been the unofficial confession booth of Vienna's cultural elite. At a corner table, shielded by a potted palm, Blaze sat opposite Sybil. Sybil was a woman carved from ice and ambition, her sharp features framed by severe, jet-black hair. As the lead arts critic for Der Standard, her reviews could canonize a musician or end their career before the ink dried. She was not a woman who wrote about the music, she wrote about the blood on the strings. And right now, her dark, predatory eyes were locked onto the maestro. "You look exhausted, Blaze," Sybil observed, tapping her silver pen against a leather-bound notebook. "The Mahler taking its toll? Or is it the pressure of the 10-year anniversary gala? The entire city is expecting a triumph tomorrow night." Blaze took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee, the bitterness matching the taste in the back of his throat. He had to play this flawlessly. He had to be the wounded genius, dropping breadcrumbs for the wolf. The Mahler is complicated this year, Sybil. Blaze began, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that immediately commanded her absolute attention. It demands a brutal honesty. You cannot conduct the Fifth Symphony if you are living a lie. The music strips you bare. Sybil's pen stilled. She leaned forward, the scent of her sharp, citrus perfume cutting through the smoke. A lie? That's an interesting word choice for a man who seemingly has it all. The perfect career, the perfect orchestra, the flawless wife. Perfection, Blaze murmured, his eyes drifting toward the window, watching the rain slick the cobblestones of the Gumpendorfer Strasse. Perfection is often just a very expensive curtain drawn over a rotting stage. He saw the immediate flicker of journalistic hunger in her eyes. Sybil was not a fool. She knew when she was being handed a shovel. "Is there trouble in paradise, maestro?" she asked softly, her voice dripping with dangerous sympathy. "Because the narrative of you and Celestine is the bedrock of this city's social scene. If the bedrock is cracking, I didn't say that," Blaze countered smoothly, reeling her back in just as she bit. "Celestine is deeply invested in her work right now, perhaps too invested in her client's secrets. And the orchestra," he let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking his head as if burdened by a profound disappointment. "There are elements within my ensemble that have grown arrogant. Prodigies who believe the rules of decency do not apply to them." "Are you referring to Julian?" Sybil asked, her pen finally moving across the paper. "He's been your protege for years. There are whispers he might secure a solo recording contract soon." Blaze let a cold, dark smile touch his lips for a fraction of a second. "Julian is certainly ambitious. He reaches for things far beyond his grasp, things that belong to others. But ambition without morality is just a slow form of suicide." He leaned closer across the marble table, his dark eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. The subtle manipulation was over. He was now speaking directly to the predator in her. "Sybil," Blaze whispered, the name a command. "Tomorrow night is not just a concert. It is an unveiling. I suggest you pay very close attention to the final movement. Not just to the stage, but to the VIP box. And to the envelope I will ensure is waiting at your seat." Sybil's breath hitched slightly, the silver pen clattering softly against the table. She stared at him, dissecting the raw, unhinged grief and the chilling calculation in his posture. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew she was sitting across from a man who was about to light a match in a room full of gasoline. "What are you doing, Blaze?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Blaze stood up, tossing a 50-euro note onto the table. He buttoned his cashmere coat, looking down at the journalist who held the power to destroy his life and the lives of those who had betrayed him. "I am finishing the symphony," he replied, turning and walking out into the Vienna rain, leaving Sybil staring at the empty chair with the most dangerous story of her career already burning in her mind. The grosser saal of the Musikverein was a golden cathedral of acoustics, breathless and empty in the pale afternoon light. Hours before the gala, the hall possessed a sacred, echoing stillness. Blaze stood alone in the center of the parquet floor, staring up at the gilded caryatids that supported the balconies. They looked down at him with serene, painted eyes, indifferent to the monstrous act he was about to commit within their temple. Beneath the bespoke tailoring of his day suit, the inner pocket of his jacket felt impossibly heavy. The original handwritten letter from Julian to Celestine was sealed inside a blank, cream-colored envelope, completely devoid of any identifying marks save for a single name elegantly printed on the front, Sybil. Blaze took a slow, measured breath, the scent of aged mahogany and floor wax filling his lungs. He began to walk toward the grand foyer, his leather soles clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. Each step was a countdown. In the main lobby, the administrative staff was swarming like anxious bees, setting up the velvet ropes and champagne stations. At the far end of the reception area, Thomas, the young stage manager, was nervously organizing a row of glossy press kits on a linen-draped table. Blaze approached silently, his towering presence causing the chatter around the table to immediately die down. Maestro, Thomas stammered, hurriedly straightening a stack of programs. We are entirely on schedule. The acoustic baffles have been adjusted exactly as you requested. Thank you, Thomas, Blaze said, his voice a smooth, calming baritone. He offered the young man a warm, paternal smile that felt like broken glass against his own lips. The preparation is flawless. However, I have one minor addition for the press pool. Blaze reached into his jacket and withdrew the cream-colored envelope. He held it between his fingers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. This was the precipice. To release the paper was to release the avalanche. He felt a phantom ache in his chest, a brief, agonizing mourning for the life he was about to obliterate. Then, his fingers went numb, and he handed it over. This is for Sybil from Der Standard, Blaze instructed quietly, ensuring his tone conveyed the precise amount of artistic secrecy. It contains my personal, handwritten notes on the interpretation of the final movement. I want her to have it before the performance begins. Place it directly inside her program. Thomas took the envelope with trembling reverence, treating it as if it were a lost manuscript by Beethoven himself. Of course, Maestro. I will slip it into her folio immediately. She is seated in row F, seat 12. I am aware of where she is sitting, Blaze murmured, his gaze drifting away from the stage manager and out toward the grand glass doors of the entrance. The gray Vienna sky was beginning to darken, gathering heavy, bruised clouds. He watched Thomas slide the lethal envelope into the glossy black folder marked for the city's most ruthless critic. The trap was set. The guillotine was raised. There was no going back to the ignorant bliss of a week ago, no returning to the beautiful lie of his marriage. Blaze turned on his heel and walked back toward the labyrinth of backstage corridors, seeking the isolated dark of his dressing room. The silence of the empty hall suddenly felt deafening, a vacuum waiting to be filled with the sound of his world tearing apart. The dressing room smelled of wilted lilies, expensive scotch, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Blaze sat perfectly still before the vanity mirror, a ghost of a man encased in a tailored, midnight blue tuxedo. The noise of the orchestra tuning drifted through the heavy oak door like a distant, chaotic tide. It was 20 minutes until the curtain rose. The door clicked open, the sound slicing through the heavy silence of the room. Blaze didn't need to look up from the mirror. The rustle of heavy silk and the intoxicating, venomous scent of Tom Ford's Black Orchid announced her arrival. Celestine stepped into the harsh, incandescent light of the dressing room. She was a vision of calculated perfection in a backless sapphire gown, her blonde hair swept into a severe, elegant twist that exposed the pale, flawless column of her neck. "My love," she murmured, her voice a soft, silken thread that made the hairs on Blaze's arms stand up. She closed the doors softly behind her, sealing them in the suffocating intimacy of the small space. She walked up behind his chair, her cool, manicured hands coming to rest on his broad shoulders. Her fingers began to massage the tense muscles at the base of his neck, a gesture so intimately familiar it made his stomach turn to lead. "You look magnificent, Blaze," she whispered, leaning down so her cheek rested against his temple. Her blue eyes met his in the reflection of the mirror. They were wide, clear, and filled with a terrifyingly convincing devotion. "The entire city is holding its breath for you." Blaze forced his jaw to unclench, his own dark eyes staring back at her reflection with a carefully constructed mask of pre-show focus. It was the performance of a lifetime. The sheer hypocrisy of her touch, the same hands that had been tangled in the sheets with Julian, the same hands that had penned the psychological profiles to extort €500,000, felt like a physical burn against his tuxedo jacket. "Thank you, Celestine," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that betrayed absolutely nothing. He reached up, covering one of her hands with his own, entirely devoid of warmth. "I am ready. The Mahler requires absolute truth." She smiled softly, a small, knowing curve of her lips that made his blood run cold. She interpreted his words as the profound artistic insight of a genius, completely blind to the lethal promise hidden within them. You always find the truth in the music, she agreed, her thumb stroking the collar of his jacket. And Julian, he's ready for the solo. I know he's nervous, but under your direction, he will shine. The audacity of her mentioning the cellist, of playing the supportive mentor's wife, was a serrated blade twisting slowly in his gut. Blaze closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, fighting the violent urge to stand up, to shatter the mirror with his bare hands, to scream the ugly, criminal truth into the suffocating air of the dressing room. But he didn't. He opened his eyes, perfectly calm, his dark gaze locking onto hers in the glass. Julian will get exactly what he deserves tonight, Blaze said quietly. Celestine leaned down and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to his cheek, a Judas kiss that sealed their fate. I'll be in the VIP box, darling, watching every move you make. I know you will, Blaze replied, his voice barely a breath. She gave his shoulders one final squeeze before turning and walking out, the heavy silk of her gown sweeping across the floor. The door clicked shut, leaving him alone in the sterile light. Blaze looked down at his right hand, the hand that would soon raise the baton. He was hollowed out, a vessel filled only with cold, metallic intent. The time for pretending was over. The execution was about to begin. The heavy velvet curtains of the grocer's saal parted, revealing a sea of 2,000 expectant faces illuminated by the warm, golden glow of the crystal chandeliers. The applause was immediate and deafening. A physical wave of admiration crashing over the stage before a single note had been played. Blaze stepped out from the wings, his posture rigid and commanding. He was a monolith of dark fabric against the vibrant backdrop of his orchestra. He did not smile, nor did he offer the customary, humble bow to the audience. He simply walked to the podium, his leather soles echoing sharply against the parquet floor, a rhythmic march toward his own execution. He stepped up, turning his back to the elite of Vienna. In the VIP box directly above the stage left, Celestine sat perfectly still, a vision in sapphire silk, her hands resting elegantly in her lap. She looked down at him with an expression of manufactured, breathless devotion. Blaze swept his gaze over the orchestra. 60 pairs of eyes snapped to attention, completely tethered to his presence. He let his gaze linger on the first chair of the cello section. Julian sat there, his instrument cradled between his knees, his bow held aloft, waiting for the command. The young prodigy looked arrogant, oblivious, and completely confident in his stolen kingdom. Blaze raised his baton. The entire hall drew a collective, sharp breath, the silence suddenly deafening. He brought the baton down with a violent, slashing motion, tearing the silence to shreds. The opening funeral march of Mahler's Symphony No. 5 exploded into the hall. The brass section ripped through the air, aggressive and mourning. It was not the mournful sigh of a passing soul. It was the enraged roar of a man who had realized his entire life was a lie. Blaze conducted with a physical ferocity that bordered on demonic, his movements sharp, jagged, and entirely unhinged. He was not leading the music. He was bleeding into it. Every aggressive stroke of his baton, every commanding sweep of his left hand, was a direct translation of the photographs burned into his brain. He poured the image of Celestine tangled in the sheets with Julian into the strings. He poured the chilling realization of her extortion into the percussion. The music swelled, dark, stormy, and completely terrifying in its intensity. As the first movement reached its chaotic climax, Blaze allowed himself a fraction of a second to break his absolute focus. Without missing a beat, without dropping the tempo, he shifted his eyes slightly over his right shoulder. In row F, seat 12, under the dim glow of the exit sign, Sybil sat entirely still. The music raged around her, but she was entirely divorced from it. In her hands, she held the blank, cream-colored envelope. She slipped her silver fingernail beneath the flap, slicing it open with a sharp, precise motion. Blaze's heart hammered against his ribs, perfectly synchronized with the heavy, punishing beat of the timpani. He watched, a cold satisfaction spreading through his veins, as the journalist unfolded the heavy linen paper inside. He saw the exact moment the words registered. Sybil's sharp, predatory features froze. She stopped breathing. She brought the letter closer to her face, her eyes darting frantically across Julian's elegant, incriminating handwriting. The confession, the offshore accounts, the psychological profiles of the Fisher couple. She slowly lowered the paper, her dark eyes snapping up from the letter to lock directly onto the maestro's rigid back. Then, she shifted her gaze upward, staring directly into the VIP box where Celestine sat, perfectly composed, completely unaware that the bullet had just left the chamber. Blaze snapped his attention back to the orchestra, his baton slicing through the air with renewed, terrifying vigor. The poison had been administered. The first movement was drawing to a close, and the destruction of his world was finally underway. The first half of the symphony concluded not with a graceful decrescendo, but with a sharp, violent snap of Blaze's baton. The sudden silence that fell over the grocer's saal was breathless, heavy with the terrifying energy he had just wrung from the orchestra. For a long, suspended moment, the 2,000 patrons simply stared at the maestro's rigid back, too stunned by the sheer, unhinged ferocity of the performance to applaud. When the applause finally broke, it was a tidal wave of manic energy. Blaze offered a single, curt bow, his face a mask of pale granite, before turning on his heel and striding off the stage. The 20-minute intermission began, and the gilded double doors of the auditorium swung open, releasing the elite of Vienna into the champagne-soaked foyers. In the dim, chaotic corridor backstage, Blaze bypassed the congratulatory attempts of the stage manager and locked himself inside his dressing room. He did not sit. He stood entirely still before the vanity mirror, staring at his reflection. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling slightly, not from exhaustion, but from the raw adrenaline of knowing what was happening just beyond the heavy oak door. Out in the grand foyer, beneath the glow of the crystal chandeliers, the social machinery was moving. Sybil did not join the line for champagne. She did not engage in the usual, sycophantic chatter about the maestro's brilliant phrasing. Instead, she stood near a marble pillar, the cream-colored envelope clutched tightly against her leather portfolio. Her eyes, usually cold and observant, were entirely feral. She was a shark that had just scented blood in the water. She pulled her sleek, black smartphone from her purse, her thumbs flying across the screen. She was not just reading the letter. She was cross-referencing. She pulled up the digital program for the evening, comparing the elegant, swooping J of the handwritten confession to the printed signature Julian used for his biography. It was a perfect match. Then, she searched the name Fisher. The prominent real estate developer and his wife were notoriously private, but Sybil's vast network of contacts was extensive. She sent 3 rapid, encrypted messages to a contact in the financial sector, asking for any unusual, massive withdrawals from the Fisher accounts in the last month. Within 4 minutes, her phone vibrated. The reply was a single, devastating sentence. €500,000 transferred to a shell company in the Caymans 3 weeks ago. The final piece clicked into place. The bomb was armed. Sybil looked up from her screen, her gaze sweeping over the crowd until she found the sapphire silk of Celestine's gown. The psychologist was holding court near the grand staircase, a crystal flute of mode in her hand, smiling graciously as several wealthy patrons complimented her husband's performance. She looked untouchable. She looked like a queen. Sybil typed furiously, drafting the headline that would shatter the facade. She didn't need to wait for Monday's print edition. This was the digital age, and she had the keys to the most trafficked cultural blog in Austria. Back in the dressing room, Blaze slowly pulled a silver pocket watch from his waistcoat. 5 minutes left of the intermission. The silence in his room was suffocating. He knew, with absolute certainty, what Sybil was doing. He could almost hear the rapid clicking of her keyboard, the digital transmission of his wife's monstrous betrayal. A soft knock interrupted his dark reverie. 3 minutes, maestro, Thomas called softly through the wood. Blaze snapped the pocket watch shut, the sound a sharp, metallic finality. He adjusted his bow tie, smoothing the lapels of his tuxedo. He was no longer just a conductor. He was the executioner. He opened the door and stepped back out into the corridor, the cacophony of the tuning orchestra greeting him like an old friend. He walked toward the wings, his eyes locking onto the glowing red exit sign above the stage door. The whispers had not yet begun, but the silence was already poisoned. The second half of the symphony was about to begin, and it would not end until everything was completely destroyed. The second half of the program commenced with the haunting, fragile beauty of the Adagietto. For the first 5 minutes, the grosser saal was suspended in absolute, reverent silence. Blaise conducted with his eyes half closed, his movements slow, agonizingly tender, a stark and terrifying contrast to the violent fury of the first movement. The music was a love letter, a tragic farewell to a life that had never truly existed. It was during the final, trembling notes of the strings that the first screen illuminated the darkness. In row M, a prominent socialite's clutch vibrated violently. She discreetly pulled out her phone, her brow furrowing at the breaking news alert from Der Standard's cultural feed. The headline was not a review of the Mahler. It was a digital guillotine, the maestro's wife, extortion, adultery, and the 6 secrets of Vienna's elite. The woman gasped softly, a sound instantly swallowed by the cellos. She tapped the screen, her eyes widening as the high-resolution scan of Julian's handwritten confession filled her display. The offshore accounts, the psychological profiling, the name Fischer. Within 30 seconds, another phone lit up in the mezzanine. Then 3 more in the orchestra seating. The digital contagion spread through the 2,000 patrons faster than fire through dry wood. It was a silent, illuminated wave of realization breaking across the audience. Blaise kept his back to the hall, but he didn't need to see the screens to know it was happening. He felt the shift in the atmosphere. The reverent silence was replaced by a chaotic, electric static, the collective rustling of silk, the sharp intakes of breath, the frantic, whispered murmurs of the city's most powerful people realizing they were sitting in the blast radius of a criminal scandal. He brought the baton down for the final, triumphant rondo finale, snapping the tempo into a frantic, dizzying pace. The music swelled, loud and aggressive, desperately trying to drown out the sudden, horrifying reality of the room. Up in the VIP box, Celestine sat perfectly still, a frozen statue of sapphire silk. She noticed the strange, agitated movement in the stalls below. She saw the tiny, blue rectangles of light flickering to life, illuminating the faces of her peers in an unflattering, ghostly pallor. Her own diamond-encrusted phone, resting in her lap, began to buzz. A text from a fellow psychologist, then another from a prominent arts board member, then a missed call from her publicist. With a slight frown, she picked it up and tapped the screen. Blaise, from his elevated podium, turned his head just a fraction of an inch to the left. He watched her. He watched the exact moment the notification from Der Standard flashed across her lock screen. He watched her eyes dart across the headline. He watched the blood completely drain from her face, leaving her a pale, hollowed-out ghost against the red velvet of the box. Her hand began to shake so violently that she dropped the phone. It clattered against the wooden floorboards, the sound amplified by the sudden, chaotic brass section. She looked down at the stage, her mouth slightly open, a silent scream of terror freezing on her lips. She looked at Julian, sawing furiously at his cello, completely ignorant of his impending doom. Then, she looked at Blaise. He did not look away. He held her gaze, his baton slicing through the air with a terrifying, mechanical precision. His dark eyes were empty of rage, empty of love, empty of anything resembling a husband. They were the eyes of an executioner who had just dropped the blade. The orchestra crashed into the final, deafening chord. Blaise held the silence for one agonizing second, 2,000 people staring at him in a mixture of awe, horror, and morbid fascination. He lowered his arms. The symphony was over. The destruction was complete. The final chord of Mahler's Symphony No. 5 hung in the air of the grosser saal, suspended in a silence that was entirely devoid of applause. Instead of the customary roar of a 2,000-strong standing ovation, a discordant, frantic hum rose from the audience. It was the sound of a city's elite rapidly digesting a catastrophe. Blaze did not bow. He did not turn to acknowledge the bewildered, terrifyingly silent orchestra behind him. He simply lowered his baton, the white stick suddenly heavy in his hand, and stepped off the podium. The leather soles of his shoes clicked sharply against the parquet floor as he walked toward the wings, his face a mask of pale, impenetrable granite. The moment the heavy velvet curtain shielded him from the audience, the chaos erupted. Backstage was a madhouse of ringing phones, panicked stagehands, and a small, aggressive contingent of press who had already bypassed security. Flashbulbs strobed in the dim corridor, blinding and disorienting. "Maestro," a voice shouted over the din. "Maestro, is the letter authentic? Did you know your wife was extorting the board?" Blaze ignored them all. He moved through the throng with the terrifying focus of a shark in bloody water, his dark eyes fixed on the heavy oak door of his dressing room. He reached the handle, shoved it open, and stepped inside, immediately locking it behind him. The sudden silence of the room was deafening, smelling faintly of the wilted lilies and his own cold sweat. He walked over to the vanity, his hands gripping the edges of the marble countertop so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stared at his reflection. The man looking back at him was victorious, powerful, and completely, utterly dead inside. 10 seconds later, the handle rattled violently. Blaze. It was a scream, raw, high-pitched, and entirely devoid of the elegant, manufactured control Celestine had perfected over a decade. "Blaze, open this door. Open the goddamn door." He turned slowly, his face blank. He reached out and turned the deadbolt. The door burst open, and Celestine practically fell into the room. She was no longer a vision in sapphire silk. Her hair was tangled, her eyes wide and manic, the mascara smudged beneath her lower lashes like bruises. She clutched her phone in a white-knuckled grip, the screen still glowing with the ruinous headline from Der Standard. Right behind her, looking utterly bewildered and terrified, was Julian. He was still clutching his cello bow, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between the maestro and the psychologist. "What did you do?" Celestine gasped, her voice trembling violently. She staggered forward, reaching out as if to grab his tuxedo lapels, but stopped short, terrified of the absolute zero in his eyes. "Tell me you didn't do this. Tell me you didn't give that letter to Sybil." Blaze leaned back against the vanity, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, resonant hum, perfectly modulated, completely terrifying. "I am a conductor, Celestine," he said simply. "I merely handed the score to the appropriate section. The performance, however, was entirely yours." Julian stepped forward, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Maestro, what letter? What is she talking about?" Blaze shifted his gaze to the young prodigy. A cold, dark smile touched the corners of his lips, devoid of any joy. "The letter you wrote 3 weeks ago, Julian. The one detailing your offshore accounts. The one where you so elegantly described extorting €500,000 from the Fisher family." The cello bow slipped from Julian's fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. The arrogant smirk that had infuriated Blaze for months vanished instantly, replaced by the hollow, slack-jawed terror of a man realizing his life was over. He stumbled back, hitting the closed door, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "No," Julian whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Blaze replied, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I understand that you played the first chair brilliantly, but you lacked the vision to see the entire symphony. You thought you were the soloist. You were just an instrument." Celestine let out a strangled, sobbing cry. She fell to her knees, the sapphire silk pooling around her on the floor. "Blaze, please. It wasn't what you think. It was a game. We can fix this. You have to tell the press it's a forgery. I am your wife." Blaze looked down at her, the woman he had loved, the woman who had analyzed his neuroses over morning espresso while orchestrating his ruin. He felt nothing. Not rage, Not pity, not even satisfaction. The vengeance he had craved so violently had burned him out completely, leaving only ash. You were a brilliant psychologist, Celestine, Blaze murmured, turning back to the mirror. You understood everything about the human mind, except the most fundamental truth. What truth? She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Blaze met his own hollow eyes in the glass. That when you push a man into the dark, you cannot complain when he learns how to see. The dressing room had transformed into a tomb, suffocating beneath the weight of absolute ruin. The frantic, muffled shouts of journalists and the distant, approaching wail of police sirens bled through the heavy oak door. The authorities were not coming for a scandalous affair. They were coming for the offshore accounts and the extortion. Julien was the first to break. With a sudden, ragged gasp that sounded like a drowning man breaking the surface, he scrambled backward, abandoning his antique cello bow on the floor. He didn't look at Celestine. He didn't look at the maestro. He simply turned and bolted through the doorway, sprinting blindly into the flashing lights of the press, choosing the wolves outside over the absolute zero of Blaze's presence. Celestine remained on the floor, a shattered porcelain doll in ruined sapphire silk. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the polished leather of Blaze's shoe. "Blaze," she whispered, her voice stripped of all its clinical elegance, reduced to the primal, pathetic begging of a trapped animal. "They will take my license. They will put me in prison. Please, you have your revenge. Tell them I was coerced. Tell them Julien manipulated me." Blaze looked down at the woman who had expertly dissected the psychological flaws of the Vienna elite while funding her escape with their darkest secrets. He felt a profound, echoing hollowness in his chest. The fiery, intoxicating rage that had fueled his every heartbeat for the past 3 days was gone, leaving behind a cold, gray landscape of ash. He had won. He had executed the perfect, flawless vengeance, and it tasted like dust. He stepped back, pulling his foot out of her reach. He didn't say a word. He simply turned his back on her weeping form, opened the door, and walked out into the corridor. The backstage area was a war zone, but Blaze moved through the chaos like a ghost. Security guards were forming a barricade against the reporters, shouting orders over the blinding strobe of camera flashes. Blaze slipped past them, ignoring the frantic questions shouted his way, and pushed open the heavy access doors leading back to the grocer's salle. The grand concert hall was entirely empty. The 2,000 patrons had fled the scandal, leaving behind discarded programs and half-empty champagne flutes. The golden crystal chandeliers had been dimmed to a melancholy, bruised twilight. The silence of the room was vast and deafening. Blaze walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He heard the hesitant, uneven click of heels behind him. Celestine had followed him out, unable to detach herself from the wreckage she had caused. She stood at the edge of the stage, a desperate silhouette in the shadows, watching him. He did not look back at her. He walked up the short steps to the conductor's podium, the wooden platform that had been his throne, his sanctuary, and ultimately, his execution block. He stood perfectly still, looking out at the sea of empty velvet seats. Slowly, methodically, he reached out and picked up the white fiberglass baton he had left resting on the music stand. He held it in his left hand. Then, he raised his right hand. With his thumb, he pushed against the heavy gold band on his ring finger. It slid off with a cold, metallic scrape. Blaze placed the wedding ring meticulously on the black velvet lip of the music stand. He laid the white baton directly beside it, perfectly parallel. The tools of his marriage and his art, both irredeemably tainted, left behind in the dark. He finally turned his head, his dark, hollow eyes locking onto Celestine's broken figure one last time. The silence stretched between them, heavier than any symphony he had ever conducted. "The final movement is over, Celestine," Blaze whispered, his voice echoing softly against the gilded walls of the empty hall. "And there will be no encore." He stepped down from the podium, turning his back on the stage, the woman, and the life he had known. He walked up the long, carpeted aisle toward the exit, disappearing into the cold Vienna night, leaving everything behind in the shadows.